popular arcade games used to tend to get ports, with varying degrees of accuracy across the systems they got a release on. Sometimes, games that were only fairly popular would get a number of ports, and some of those might try to do something a little different from the original. Such is the case of Toki going apeshit on the Sega Genesis. It's not a one-to-one port of the arcade Toki. This version of Toki exists in a middle ground where the game is not an exact port or quite a sequel. It's more like an expansion pack that takes the original and tweaks it and expands upon it ever so slightly. How does it fare compared to the original? Toki was originally released into arcades in 1989, developed by TAD Corporation, a company created by former Data East employees and probably most well known for arcade games such as Cabal and Blood Brothers. Toki has a certain visual appeal that skews more towards a Western cartoon design aesthetic with a weird and quirky charm through the character with an oversized head jumping around in a colorful world full of perplexing enemies. Zombie apes, giant spiders, fire-breathing lizards, ghosts, and more fill up this odd prehistoric world. Toki stood out with the interesting look along with tough gameplay that took traditional platforming and mixed in run-and-gun elements. Toki's ability to fire off projectiles from his mouth gives him an edge against the enemies, and it somehow suits the character well. I remember seeing this at my local arcade as a kid and played it every so often until that arcade closed, and I enjoyed the gameplay and graphics quite a lot. Though I was never able to get too far, maybe the second or third level on a good run. The arcade game was successful enough to warrant a slew of ports, everything from NES to Genesis, the microcomputers, Amiga, Atari ST, Commodore 64, and even the Lynx got a version. The Genesis version was ported by Santos and published by Sega. Santos had previously worked on the ports of Master System games such as Alex Kidd Lost Stars, Fantasy Zone The Maze, and Dynamite Ducks. You would hope this would be a straightforward port. It actually ends up more like a slightly extended version, or perhaps we could think of it as Toki 1.5. This port released in 1992, and the US version arrived with the subtitle Going Apeshit, as a play on the phrase going apeshit, but instead referencing the way that Toki shoots fireballs from his mouth, on par with the rather edgy Sega marketing of the Genesis at the time. The game is known as Juju Gensetsu in Japan and retained the same title for the Mega Drive version. I didn't know about this port until a couple of years back, and I was really excited to give it a shot as a fan of the arcade game. So let's dive in and see what they did here to set this port apart. The story in the Genesis game is a bit different from the arcade version. In the original, Toki's girlfriend Miho gets captured by the evil Bashtar and finds himself changed into an ape by the witch doctor Vukimedlo. In the Genesis version, Dr. Andrew Stark is a mad scientist who replaces the witch doctor, and at the opening of the game, we see he raises a city from the ground, which Toki and his girlfriend Wanda watch happening in the distance. Upon this event, Wanda is captured and taken into the risen city, while Toki is transformed into an ape by Dr. Stark. From there, he must travel into the ruins and rescue Wanda while thwarting the plans of Dr. Stark. The music is really good for the intro scene, and it is similar to something from Sonic. Looking through walkthrough videos, I noticed a lot of people said this intro story scene was scary to them when they originally played it. For the gameplay, Toki plays pretty much like your typical 2D platformer, with the additional ability to shoot in multiple directions from the ground and only left and right while in the air. Toki can crouch and crawl as well as aim diagonally. The ground has an effect on how he shoots, so when on a decline, he will automatically angle downward if you crouch and fire, and the converse is true when walking upwards. He can pick up shot power-ups that are scattered within the levels and occasionally dropped by enemies. There are multiple shot types like spread shot, charge up shot, flamethrower, and bounce. These are limited by a certain amount of time before they will begin to flash in the HUD and then disappear, but you can use them as much as you want until the time runs out on the power-up, similar to something like Fantasy Zone. Toki has the ability to jump on enemies to hurt them a la Mario Brothers, but the hit mechanics can be a bit tricky to nail down. He is also very fragile and can only take a single hit before dying. Toki will walk at a very slow pace, slower than he walked in the arcade version, so the game can feel like it's really dragging whenever you have to walk around, and Toki just takes forever to get across an area. This game has no run button. In the ice stage, he can walk down the icy inclines and gain some speed, but it's just for the one level really. You can also pick up a pair of sneakers that will temporarily increase your jumping ability, or pick up a star to get limited invincibility. In the arcade, you could get a football helmet that would protect Toki for an additional hit or two, but it's nowhere to be found here in this version. There are also fruit scattered around as well as coins. 50 fruit will net you an extra life. Coins count towards 3 fruit points. There are also 1-ups that can be picked up at hard to reach locations. There is a decent amount of creative enemies to deal with. Spiders that shoot fire, lots of bugs, ghosts, and other apes of course. The bosses are pretty creative and unique, but they do feel a bit simple, like they're from the early arcade boss era. And they don't have many surprises, consisting of only a single attack or two that you need to memorize from their patterns. My favorite is Bashtar, who is a set of disembodied hands and feet with a floating heart, followed by my second favorite, the weird giant burping Mogulvar. We get more levels in this port, but it kind of just spreads out the same themes across more stages. The arcade goes from 6 levels up to 9 here. Jungles, lots of caves, an ice stage and a lava stage, then the final enemy headquarters. Instead of allowing the player to start near where they died, the stages are now comprised of 3 segments each, and you have to go back to whatever checkpoint you last made it to. At the end of each segment is an exit sign that Toki must touch to move on to the next section of the stage that becomes the checkpoint. In the arcade stages, they were more compact and it felt brisk and stimulating. Here, they seem to fall into a slog of memorization and trial and error with some baffling design choices, resulting in spots where Toki just feels like he's walking straight ahead for extended portion. It doesn't add much to the game except padding to the length. One of the main issues I have with the game is how it wants the player to make too many leap of faith type jumps, either up or down, and you can force the screen to scroll a little by pressing the D-pad up or down, but it's not intuitive to play this way, and there are many cases where you will have no clue where the hazard or safe spot is until you die first. Many areas are focused on vertical movement, and you will find yourself unintentionally jumping directly into enemies that you couldn't see or falling on them with no time to react. This is easily one of the most frustrating aspects of the gameplay. Some people might say this is a way to bring up the challenge, but it's just cheap deaths in my opinion. You get 3 lives and 2 continues on normal mode without changing any of the settings. You can add more lives and continues and also set the difficulty in the options menu. On higher difficulty modes, they really went crazy with the challenge. Enemies take way more hits to defeat. They spawn far more often, such as ghosts before each pit or jump, and there's added hazards such as flame spouts littering the stages. With this in mind, this is a game that is greatly benefited by using save states in between levels to prevent having to start over and over from the beginning while you slowly memorize the levels and boss patterns. There is certainly some good gameplay moments, but it's hampered by those issues that keep it from reaching the heights of greatness. And if you're worried about that internet clout, why not just practice the game using save states and then do a couple legit runs to make yourself feel better so you can chase that clout of a real gamer. At the conclusion of the game, you get a simple ending of Toki rescuing the girl and turning back into his original form. Then you get a nice list of the enemies and their names, and finally the credits. Nothing too shabby, but not really any cool animations or splash screens, which could have added a little something nice for the ending. The graphics certainly have that early Genesis release look and feel to them. Toki's face looks less defined and less expressive than the arcade, not quite capturing the whimsical look of the original, but it's not terribly off, just not quite right. The enemies mostly look easy to recognize from the arcade and are appropriately detailed with a creepy dark look to them. The stages have rather dark and muted colors and repeat many of the same tiles across the levels without much variety, but they are very detailed. The ice stage in this version flashes the entire screen, which can be an eyesore after a couple of minutes in. The arcade version used a far more subtle effect with better results. In the original, there was a cute map screen before each stage, similar to what you would see before each stage in Ghosts and Goblins. However, it is removed in the Genesis version. The stages are often laid out with a meandering zigzag method that Toki needs to cover in order to get through them. Up and back down, left and then right, and repeat. The bosses do look pretty good overall and are certainly some of the high points as far as graphics, looking very close to the arcade version, featuring slightly altered attacks, but the backgrounds are the same for every boss and it's a simple gray rock wall. Boring. A couple other examples of the changes are one of the kind of mid-bosses is made into the first boss here in the Genesis version, and we get an extra boss in the underwater stage with this ape submarine. The music does a fair job of nailing the sound of the original, and there is not a large number of songs in the game, from the title screen, underwater stage, boss music tracks, regular and 2 final bosses, and then the story portions and ending. So you will hear that main stage music theme most of the time, but thankfully it's not grating and it does a good job covering the original arcade tune. Just would have liked to had a couple more songs added to this. So what's my verdict? Well, Toki really deserved a good port or sequel on the Genesis, and sadly this game just falls short in my opinion, but I have seen that opinions tend to differ on this game. One might guess that the development was rushed, especially when we look at some of the other versions of Toki that released at the time. The NES game was much closer to the arcade as far as the levels, but it added a life bar to bring the difficulty down, making it a solid and welcoming version for fans of the arcade and NES console. The Lynx version is not bad at all, and even the Amiga got a faithful port, which seems to be remembered quite fondly by many. More recently, there was a remake that came out in 2019 and is currently on Steam as well as other contemporary consoles. It's a remake of the original with very nice hand-drawn animation and is definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of the original. It went through some development issues, but it's great to see it got a release and it's regarded pretty well from what I can tell. This is a great version to play for fans. Hopefully there might even be a possible sequel eventually, you never know. The Genesis version, while not a terrible game, is probably best for those curious about this version, or fans of those early Genesis releases that had a lot of character and some unique design choices that still make for an entertaining experience for retro gaming fans. And that's going to wrap it up today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Take care.